Okay, it's 6:30, so I'm going to call the October 22nd meeting of the Oxford Board of Zoning Appeals to order. Annie, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Chet Smith,
Here.
Mr. Steve Chaffin,
Here.
Mr. Matt Wyatt,
Here.
Mr. Baljan Deshdory, and Mr. Philippe Rousseau.
Present. Thank you. Next order of business is approval of the August 27, 2024 minutes of the regular meeting.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a motion to amend the minutes? Is that appropriate?
Let's get them on the floor first.
I'll make a
And then you
motion
can
to
amend
approve
them.
them, yeah.
So I'll take a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll move.
Second,
Second.
moved and seconded. Are there amendments,
Yes,
additions,
Mr.
modifications?
I would like to move to amend. On page 4, where we have the motion to grant the variance, and we have the roll call vote, I voted no. I would like to add a sentence after that word, that's possible.
Well, what's the sentence?
The sentence would say, Mr. Chapin stated that the applicant failed to provide evidence by preponderance that practical difficulties existed to grant the variance. I just want to state the reasons why I voted. I think the minutes should reflect the substance of the meeting, not just what happened. I've been reading up on about minutes. They're supposed to be a little more substantive than just how people voted.
Minutes are a record of official actions under the Ohio Public Meetings Law and Records Law, but I don't have a particular objection. Does anyone else have an objection to? Annie, did you get that sentence?
Oh, I can read it again if
Okay.
you need to.
It's on recording.
On recording.
That's fine.
Thank you.
But I'm going to need a second to accept the modification of those minutes.
Is that normal proceeding for this board to add comments to a yes or no vote?
And I can weigh in on the minutes portion of this if you'd like. So the minutes, and I did not hear Mr. Chaffin's specific comment as to what he wants to add, but I will just make a general comment about the minutes. So the minutes are not intended to be a verbatim summary of what happens. And the case law and Ohio Public Records Law is reflective of that. So a general summary of actions taken is appropriate for minutes, just so we're all operating under the same understanding. So, yeah.
I'd like to see if somebody would second my motion, please. If they don't, they don't.
Yeah, you can die
Yeah.
for a second. I don't hear a second, so we're going to move to approval of the minutes. Any other modifications, changes, additions, deletions? Thank you. All in favor of approving the minutes, could you please take the roll on that, Annie?
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Approval of the minutes.
Yes.
Mr. Chaffin,
No.
Mr. Wyatt,
I'm sorry, you said Wyatt? Okay,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Mr. Rousseau.
Abstain. I was not here. The minutes have been approved. Okay, let's move to new business. The first case is BZA 2024-03, 417 East Withrow Street, a variance to section 1143.07, maximum lot coverage. Mr. Moore.
And I'm going to make a comment about that, Mr. Chair. It's my understanding that the applicant has voluntarily elected to withdraw that case 2024-03 from the agenda tonight, and it's my understanding that the applicant is intending to proceed with that case potentially at the next hearing next month.
Okay. So that case is no longer on our agenda. Thank you. Then let's move to the second case for this evening at this meeting, BZA 2024-05, 315 University Avenue. A variance to section 1143.07 D5B, minimum roof pitch. Mr. Moore. Counsel, will you swear in the staff?
Mr. Moore, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth tonight?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, board members. So again, this is BZA 2024-05. This is located at 315 University Avenue, and this is a variance to minimum roof pitch. There we go. So the applicant for this request is Mr. Scott Webb, architect. The property owner is Gracie Holding Limited. The zoning classification applicable to the property is R3MS, single, 2, and 3 family, mile square residential district. The current use of the property, it's a single family dwelling. And the proposal is a requested variance to section 1143.07, subsection D, subsection 5, subsection B. Again, this is minimum roof pitch. And the purpose of requesting this particular variance is to enable a rear dormer addition. Here is a location map showing where the subject property is along University Avenue. So here is East Sycamore Street. Here's Bishop Street off to the east. Presently, it is 2 parcels, but I believe the intent is going to be to consolidate those 2 together to more or less dissolve the line in between, and that will resolve a setback consideration that was part of the zoning review comments on the original permit. So that is no longer an issue that needs to be examined by a BZA in particular. The only issue that needs to be addressed would be, of course, to the minimum roof pitch. And here's a look at the zoning classifications in the area. So in large part, it's all within the R3MS, that 3-family district. The MU University District is off to the northeast here. So essentially, these are parcels that are part of Miami's campus. And here is an aerial view shot in December of 2023. Here's a street view from August 2024. I believe this is from Google, showing you the existing conditions. Okay, so section 1143.07D5B provides the following language. It specifies that roof pitches for residential structures must be steep. A minimum pitch ratio of 6 to 12 is required, with the exception of porch roofs that should have a minimum pitch ratio of 4 to 12. So the particular phrase out of this paragraph that is the subject of the variance tonight is where it specifies minimum pitch ratio of 6 to 12. I'm trying to find my locate the decision criteria. There we go. Moving on. So just to explain a little bit about roof pitch. So roof pitch is measured as rise over span. So here you can see roof pitch ranging from 112 to 1212. So another way of expressing 612 is for every 12 feet of width, there is 6 feet of rise. And just to give you a sense for some of the existing precedents in town, so staff has allowed perfectly flat porch roofs in the past without need for a variance. And this is quite common in traditional architecture, so we see no reason not to allow these particular features. Essentially, it's an absence of pitch. We've also allowed for dormer additions in the past, and an example being 101 Ardmore Drive. So here's a photograph of the completed addition right here, and then here's an overhead shot. And the reason that this was found compliant was because there was still roof planes that were still sloping and meeting that minimum 6 to 12 pitch. And for that reason, we found this to be compliant. So comparing 101 Ardmore to the subject site at 315 University, here is a sketch of the rough location where the proposed addition would going. So this would be completely contained to the rear of the structure. It would not impact the front-facing slope of the structure. That would remain in place. And here's a look at the architect's elevation drawing. This is the rear of the structure, so the new portion of the structure here is highlighted in orange. And then here is a side profile with the new portion. And I believe the plan would be, if the variance were approved, this rake line would be preserved, so there would be at least an element to kind of accentuate that particular pitch remaining. But there would not be a sloping roof beyond that rake. So it's time to go through the decision criteria. So as a reminder to the board, in accordance with section 1139.02C1, the burden of proof is upon the applicant to present reliable and substantial evidence that supports the request for variance. Furthermore, per section 1139.02C2, the BZA must find that practical difficulties exist that would render strict application of the code unreasonable. So in determining whether such practical difficulties exist that are sufficient to warrant this variance, the board is using these 8 decision criteria, A through H. So starting with criterion A, whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. The land use of the property is not in jeopardy with this request. It's presently a single-family dwelling. It would remain a single-family dwelling. So the existing use may continue in its present state or be modified in a way that's compliant with the zoning code. So for these reasons, we find that A does not lend support toward granting the variance. Criterion B is whether the variance is substantial. We find that this supports granting the variance. And it is true that staff and the applicant, we disagree as to whether the addition should in fact be considered a dormer and thus exempt from the roof pitch standard. A true dormer that otherwise provides for sloping roof planes on either side, whether it be in the front or the rear of the structure, we would permit this administratively without issue or need for a variance. In this case, because the addition is effectively concealed from the street by being located on the rear side of the structure, otherwise preserving that sufficiently sloped roof in front, we feel the architectural integrity of the structure would not be compromised. So therefore, we find this variance is not substantial, despite the stark numerical difference between the pitch that's being requested, which is close to a 112 roof pitch, compared to the minimum standard of 612. Criterion C is whether the essential character of the neighborhood excuse me, would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment as a result of the variance. So again, with no change to the front facade, we agree with the applicant's assessment. Essential character of the neighborhood would remain intact with no substantial detriments to surrounding properties. D is whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. We did not receive any comments or concerns from the city engineer, fire chief, or police chief on this matter. So the granting of this variance is not expected to have any adverse impacts. E is whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. So per the applicant's letter, the property owner was not initially aware of the zoning restriction, which is under scrutiny with this hearing. So we find that E supports granting the variance. F is whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. So it is true that we could address this predicament through a revision to the design that would elevate that roof ridge line such that the 612 pitch, the minimum pitch, would be met on the new rear-facing slope. And it is true that such an alteration would increase costs and more significantly disturb the original house design, but it is theoretically accomplishable. And an increase in cost is never a reason to deny a variance. Keep that in mind. But overall, for criterion F, we find there is a way for the predicament to be resolved through some method other than a variance. So for this reason, we find F does not lend any support toward granting a variance. Excuse me. G is whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done. by granting the variance. So this section of the zoning code provides language justifying the purpose and intent of what are termed the mile square design standards, which are inclusive of the subject roof pitch standard. Excuse me, I'm gonna grab a drink of water. This section articulates that standards are not intended to dictate any specific architectural style or design, but rather are intended to allow imaginative design that is respectful to surrounding properties and the overall district. And I'm reading basically verbatim out of the code within the staff report here, so the quote from the code is in italics. The mile square design standards are intended to provide predictable requirements while also allowing for flexibility in design. Many standards within this section use passive language, for example, using words like should or encouraged, as opposed to shall. Sorry, my throat is fighting me tonight. And when using this passive language, you could construe these provisions more as guidelines rather than as rigid, objectively enforced standards. So on the subject of roof pitch specifically, the code is more adamant that it should fall into the latter category of being a definite requirement. But despite the code's relative firmness on the matter, and I can go back to the slide that has the language. So using the word required, is required, that is not passive language, that is very rigid language. But despite this firmness, we have permitted literal exceptions to this provision in the past when involving common forms of architecture, such as flat porches and dormers, as I've explained. So in this particular instance, for this standard, we believe the spirit of the requirement would actually be better met through the approval of an exception in lieu of necessitating what we believe would be a more absurd roof line if the 612 minimum roof pitch were complied with. So for that reason, we find G actually supports granting the variance. Excuse me. We'll go back to the slide with the criteria. So we end with criterion H, which is any other relevant factor, and our comprehensive plan touches on a number of action statements related to this request. So action L1A6 addresses the, excuse me, the eventual creation of design guidelines for residential and commercial development. And of course, it's true that guidelines of the sort already exist and are on the books for the MS districts, those being R1MS, R2MS, and R3MS. And those are titled, of course, the Mile Square Design Standards. While the very nature of guidelines should imply the ability for some latitude and flexibility to be exercised, when provisions are written in active language using words like shall and require, the ability for a zoning administrator, such as myself, to operate in this manner is effectively extinguished. And it's true that we do have an opportunity to modernize our zoning code to provide for a more administrative route to achieving variations to what I would term as a fairly minor project detail that does not otherwise negatively affect adjoining owners or the community at large. So I will mention we have a town hall coming up later this week on this very subject. We are beginning an overall update to our development codes, our planning code, our zoning code, dealing with zoning and subdivisions. So we have a town hall coming up Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, Presbyterian Seminary. So as a part of that effort with our consultants, there is an opportunity where matters like this, particular one on roof pitch, there may be an opportunity later in the future to bring this under a more administrative umbrella. And that would be all we have to say about Criterion H. So with that, that concludes my report. Thanks for bearing with me and my coughs. I'm happy to take any questions from the board.
Questions?
So, Zach, you and I met, and I was curious about this design standards. You explained to me that they were enacted, and you gave me an example of a fairly unique, I guess, design that had existed at one time. So apparently the city council felt that this was not an appropriate way to allow construction. Is that correct?
So my understanding of it is there were examples in town where there was not an embracing of traditional architectural character. So, and I cannot confirm this as a 100% fact because I wasn't here to witness it. So it's essentially just hearsay when it comes to what I've heard anecdotally from others who work for the city and know the history. But my understanding of it was the mile square design standards were a reaction to some of those more, perhaps what I'll call modernistic designs that didn't embrace those traditional principles. And steeper roof pitch is certainly a part of that, front porches, that type of thing.
And the language about shall versus may, or, that's pretty strong, isn't it? I mean, in the law, when you say shall, that means you've got to pretty much do it. Is that correct?
That's normally the protocol,
Okay.
is when we are reading out of the code and there's words like shall and require, then it's pretty cut and dry at that point. That's what it's assumed to be.
And I'm trying to understand this concept of the absurd roof line. If
I think that will be best presented by the applicant's
Okay.
slideshow. I did take a peek at the slides, and I think you'll get an impression for that when the applicant speaks.
Now, did the applicant ever consider these roof offsets that you said, gave us an example of where you might find it was in compliance? Was that ever considered? Is it available?
We
in
did
this?
mention that. I mentioned the example of 101 Ardmore. So I suppose there might have been an opportunity to try to revise the design to embrace something that would be more akin to that. But I'm
That
not
wasn't
sure of
done.
the particulars of that.
That hasn't been done.
We have not seen a revised design.
Did you suggest that you might do that?
I suppose I might have hinted at that by suggesting or trying to draw the comparison to a past example with 101 Ardmore Drive.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Moore? I have one on criterion B. We talk about whether the variance is substantial. The final observation that you make in the staff report is about looking at some comparable coverage within the city, within the mile square, that the findings indicate a serious need to evaluate the appropriateness of the 45% limit imposed on mile square residential properties until a wide sweeping amendment is considered through legislative process. The BCA has authority to consider variation on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, so Mr. Chair, you're actually reading from the 417 East Wythe Road staff report.
I am. Well, that's not good. No, I'm reading from, no. My pages
So
are mixed
the
up.
criterion B language would be on page 29 of your packet.
My copy is mixed up. The variance is not substantial despite the stark numerical difference. Okay. I withdraw my question.
I have a question about dormers. Just so I understand, if a dormer is in the front of the house, it could be handled administratively. It's only when it's in the rear or hidden of a structure do we have to get a
So
variance?
it's precisely that aspect of, because it's in the rear and it's concealed from the street, we find it's not substantial. If this were being done in the front of the structure without those sloping planes with the shingles running down either side, then hypothetically, I think I can volunteer this as a hypothetical. Staff would likely find that as being substantial in that case. But because this dormer is to the rear of the structure It's relatively, out of view of the public realm. You're not gonna really be able to see it from the street. For that reason, we don't feel that it's substantial.
Okay, so the 6-to-12 ratio, does that apply to the front dormer?
It would apply, if it was doing a dormer similar to this one. So, let me go back to my slides here for a moment. So, if we were to pretend that this area of the structure here were being built onto the front, then this standard would be applied the same, and we would still be here tonight
Okay,
to examine a variance. Now, if it were similar to how 101 Ardmore had been developed in the rear, like so, then probably not. We probably would find that to be permitted
okay.
because of the preservation of roof lines that are meeting that minimum pitch.
Got it.
Do we know when the 101 Ardmore property was, do we know an approximate date on when that was conducted? Was
I would say this was early on when I started here, so probably 2019
okay.
would
So
be my best
relatively-
guess.
So relatively recently, within
Relatively.
the same
Yes.
Code.
Yes,
Okay.
same code, yes.
I got one
Yes.
question. So I'm a little confused still. So if this modification was to be done on the front instead of the back, would you still recommend that the variance be granted?
If this exact modification
Yes.
was being done on the front, I would find it substantial, and that would likely push me into the category of finding that there's insubstantial evidence to support. We would still apply all of the decision criteria, but to me, it would be far more substantial in the front of the structure versus in the rear.
Well,
So to
that-
me, that's the critical factor.
Well, that kind of gets to the question I wanted to ask about case-by-case basis, 101 Ardmore. I'm not sure why that's being introduced, other than, for what purpose?
The statement case by case,
No, 101 Ardmore. I mean, we will do this case-by-case, these are case-by-case. So I'm just wondering why Ardmore was introduced as a comparative reference. To simply show what's remained a 12 pitch that
yeah,
would
the
bring it
reason
into
I
compliance.
wanted to bring it up is as an example of a precedent. So in my mind, a precedent has been set in that staff has allowed for a roof slope that would be less than the minimum standard, contingent on it embracing a certain architectural principle or feature like a dormer. If you think of dormers that are much smaller as well, if you think of traditional architecture like I suppose it would be a Cape Cod style that would have, 2 dormers on a roof, we wouldn't be applying the minimum roof pitch standard to those individual dormers.
So what's the basis of the disagreement then between the applicant and staff about what constitutes a dormer?
Well, I'll return to the slide
Okay.
and articulate that for you. That's a good question. Gotta go forward here.
Well, stop at one, go back to the Ardmore piece real quick, because
Sure.
you're the one who introduced that.
Is this slide okay here, or do you wanna,
No, the Ardmore,
with the photograph?
there, right there.
Okay,
So that's a dormer in your,
this is a dormer addition.
okay.
Yes. So it really comes down to having a more substantial roof line. And what the applicant is proposing with 315 University is just to have a rake line along the side, but this facade plane would otherwise extend upward. So it's a slippery slope, I guess I'll put it that way.
612 generally is, 612 is pretty slippery, yeah. And to go back to Steve's question, if this was the front, there'd be no question in your mind that this was out
To
of
me,
compliance.
yeah, criterion B I would apply a lot of weight to criterion B if this were located in the front
So
of the structure.
because it's in the back,
Yes, I don't feel that it's substantial. It is a stark numerical difference, so if the board disagrees with my finding,
yeah,
you could find that criterion B does not lend any support toward granting the variance, in which case you're just weighing the various criteria to come to a determination. Is there substantial evidence that warrants practical difficulty to apply in this situation and be granted a variance or not?
thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Should we count his attendance?
Yeah, so
I apologize for being late, everybody.
my recommendation, so for the record, I suppose Mr. Dash George missed a portion of staff's presentation of the case. I would probably recommend that he abstain from voting just because that is a portion of the evidence that's relevant. Certainly, he can stay up on the dais and listen to the case, but probably abstain from voting tonight.
I agree with the counselor's recommendation there. For the applicant, Mr. Webb.
Mr. Webb, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth with your testimony tonight, sir?
I do, thank you. There we go. Okay, so this is my second trip here with the new Board of Zoning Appeals, and once again, I'm going to try to just bring this down to make it really simple. I think we get kind of bogged down in lots of minutia here. As many of you know, I've been at this in private practice. This is my 25th year in business. I've done pretty much everything you've seen on the screen tonight, including 101 Ardmore. And that's exactly why this is the decision that we made. If you are familiar with my work at all, you know that I try to be contextual in all cases. My additions look like they belong on the house. I don't introduce new elements. I don't try to do something unusual. I believe in the mile square guidelines and I try to follow them. And this particular design, at the time, this is a very, very small house built in the 40s, kind of right around the time of the Second World War. All the rooms are really small in the house, and there is like the Ardmore one, like we have these scattered all over town, around Central Avenue, all over town, really. The upstairs is pretty limited. It's typically slope ceilings, one bedroom up there. This one had kind of a slope ceiling room that went about the length of it with a small bathroom up there. Headroom is severely limited. So, you know, the idea is simply how can we get some more headroom up into that second floor and make it more usable for the tenants. This is not proposed to be an increase in occupancy. This doesn't change anything about the use of the building whatsoever. We're just simply trying to get some headroom in there. And as such, we looked at doing it as a shed dormer. And so specific to what Zach was talking about, there we go. So the idea here was to maintain that rake piece for a couple different reasons. One is the windows and everything are centered in that. I think it's important that that remains. You know, we could have simply taken this off and just, you know, made a big odd shaped side to the building, which we obviously chose not to do. But there's a couple different options on how that could have been done. So at the top right, the idea of putting this dormer addition to the rear, as Zach pointed out, it remains behind the original facade. It's appropriate for the style. It's very common, as we've talked about this evening, for shed dormers to be done here. A shed dormer on the front of the building would be more like a bungalow style, which we also have lots of those around town. Shed dormers on the front of the building, that wouldn't be appropriate here. I wouldn't propose it here. This is not a bungalow building. If we were going to do a more significant second-story upgrade, we would likely lift the entire roof and turn it into something else than it is right now. But the intention right now is to try to be contextual, try to save as much of the house as possible and kind of reflect its architecture. On the bottom, if we were to follow the letter of the law in this case and still wanted to add a little second floor area to the back, it results in a much higher roof pitch. This line kind of represents how much taller it gets. The building just seems kind of awkward and out of proportion, in my opinion. when we talk about a practical difficulty, there's a reason why we frame dormers the way we do. And not to get too construction-y on you here, but essentially, this is a rafter frame house, so it has a strong ridge. So the ridge is doing the work, and currently the rafters come up in both directions of the ridge, making the triangle that holds the thing in place. So dormers allow us the opportunity to maintain that beam as a ridge, or that ridge as a beam, I should say. So it's still going to be going from edge to edge of the building, and we're simply going to exchange the rafters that were in their place, tie right back onto that strong ridge, which is doing the work for the second floor right now, and just putting a dormer to the back. And the little illustration that I'm showing down here to try to bring these pitches up, in addition to the fact that it looks a little odd and leaves the windows kind of randomly placed there, it's also not structurally great. We're not using the ridge beam in the same way. We're trying to create a new ridge beam and span from a new ridge beam down to the other ridge beam held up by these rafters. We're stacking roofs on top of roofs. The practical difficulty is it is extremely hard to physically do that. That, of course, results in expense. Expense we're not allowed to talk about. It's not really one of your decision criterias. That being said, there is a practical difficulty involved here, which is, can we save the majority of this roof and frame it in a normal way, as opposed to trying to come up with some clever, inventive way to sort of frame this to accomplish what appears to me to be a somewhat arbitrary restriction in the code. So I'd like to go back to the Ardmore question just a bit and kind of the big picture here. So while staff has, in fact, approved the Ardmore administratively, did not require us to come to Board of Zoning Appeals for a very similar issue as this, with the idea that, well, that one is more of a dormer, this one's not a dormer. I think it should be pointed out that our zoning code does not define dormers in any way. And so to say that Ardmore had 12 inches of roof along the side, that's enough. 4 inches of roof along the side, not enough. That makes it not a dormer. I don't think that's really in your zoning code. I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. So, if a dormer is not defined and it's not an exception to our roof pitch standard, then by right, Ardmore should have been at Board of Zoning Appeals as well. So anyway, I think there's room for some interpretation, all this being said. And as I pointed out when we started talking about this case before we came here, to me there's a bit of a conflict in the code in that we have our mile square guidelines and our comp plan that talks about preserving the mile square, contextual architecture, making sure we maintain all these things, and then we have a standard that really doesn't make any sense. I think the dormer idea should be an exception, not just, right now the exception is just porch roofs and some other minor things like that. Perhaps dormers should be an exception to this because shed dormers are very common vernacular architecture, very common trait. They're all over the city. They're never going to be at 612 pitch. The roof would have to be at 1412 to have a 612 pitch not come up over the roof of the existing house. So I think perhaps as we re-examine our zoning code moving forward, that'll have to be looked at. Either, we define dormer and we, decide what a dormer is and make an exception for it, or we don't, and deal with the mile square thing overall. So that being said, like I said, I believe that the contextual nature of it is the most important thing here, and from a design standpoint, we chose to follow the general rules of the mile square guidelines and try to lead into the idea that dormers are allowed, have been allowed in the past. So the question ultimately I would ask to staff is that, if this is not a dormer, if 4 inches in on each side isn't enough, 12 inches is, where is that dimension? And I can meet it probably. It's just, again, we're trying to make we'd end up making the second floor smaller to accommodate this arbitrary zoning guideline that says, not a guideline, a prescription, so to speak, in this case. So before we get into that last bit, I would like to say, try to clear this up as much as possible. So when Zach is talking about the words must, shall, and required, that directs his job, not yours. That says that he is not allowed to approve these things administratively. there's not any gray area there. That's not to say that Board of Zoning Appeals can't approve these things. As we talked about last time, there's an entire chapter in our zoning code that creates this body and empowers this body to make exceptions for practical difficulties or for the right reasons. And hopefully, that's what we'll be talking about this evening. So with regard to the decision standards, I agree with all of Zach's answers to the decision standard, short of, the reason that we're doing this, yes, there is a, how we define reasonable return for the first decision standard. What's happening here, as you look around the mile square, is all these properties get improved, these small houses in good locations get left behind. And this is year by year getting harder to rent. This is the first time in the 20-some years that Karen has owned the property, it's not currently rented. So that is the impetus to make some improvements. We've opted not to simply tear it down and put a big building in there, but to try to do something more contextual, save the house, do a more surgical addition, so to speak, and in order to move forward and make some improvements to the property. So with that, I would entertain any questions.
Questions?
Oh, you say she can't rent the property, that's why she wants to do this. Is that what you're saying to us?
No, what I'm saying is the property is not currently renting. It's been getting harder and harder to rent year after year. I'm not saying she can't rent it. I'm
So
sure.
that's because of the market, and there's a lot of
Yeah, the
property.
market's changing, absolutely.
There's been some development, multifamily housing.
Your competitors are constantly improving. If you're not, you're being left behind.
Sure. Is this, could this have been a single-family residence? Could it be used as a single-family residence?
It is a single-family
Okay.
residence.
Wouldn't there be a market for that? I mean, if he just sold the property as opposed to trying to improve it?
I'm not sure what that has to do with our
I'm just
case at
asking
hand.
questions. It may not be
Sure,
relevant.
every property could be sold and used for some other use. Certainly, that's really not the questions that we're addressing.
Did you or the owner consider doing the roof offsets to make it look more like Ardmore?
Doing what?
The roof offsets, did you ever consider it? Did the owner consider it?
Yeah, I considered it. And as I explained to you, we don't define dormers, or there is no definition of how far inset it needs to be a dormer. Dormers have been allowed. There's nothing that says I can't bring it out to the edge. From an architectural standpoint, I wanted to still leave the rake and still leave the impression that it is in fact a dormer, but to try to maximize what we could do on the backside of the property.
But apparently you and Zach have disagreements about this. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear. He said in his staff report that, even though he's calling it a dormer and I'm calling it a dormer, when we get to the nitty-gritty, he's not calling it a dormer and I'm still calling it a dormer.
But he made it clear to us that had there been a 12-inch remaining pitch on that roof, that it would have been an administrative decision, wouldn't even be here. But did you guys discuss that, or?
We didn't really discuss that. We discussed the other option of just simply meeting the code. As I said, there's no definition of dormer. There's no exception for roof pitch on the dormer. So when Zach leaned into, this section of the code must be 612. If there's no exception for a dormer, I got to make this 612.
So when you say there's no definition of a dormer,
Right.
you mean in the zoning code?
Exactly.
Is what you're referring to.
Exactly.
But yet Ardmore was presented to us as an example of a dormer.
And so is this. Well, actually, Ardmore was never
Well,
presented
this
to you.
is before us.
And
If
Ardmore
it
was
had
never
been
presented to this
determined to
body.
be a dormer, then you would have administratively approved it. Yes? Zach?
I think the way that I would explain my thinking on this one, so when confronted with a plan that does not, on its face, embrace a standard of our zoning code, that being the 612 minimum pitch, what I try to be cognizant of in any case is ensuring that I'm treating all cases equally under the code. So I looked for examples, similar examples in the past that I had reviewed myself as the zoning official to see, okay, where have I kind of drawn the line, right? I mentioned slippery slope earlier. And of course, I found the example, the most comparable example I could find was 101 Ardmore. And I was probably confronted with similar questions at the time. It's hard for me to remember exactly what my thinking was circa 2019, assuming that was the year that I was looking at that case. But I could conclusively determine from that search of prior permits, prior cases, that there was another example in town that had been permitted administratively, and that had been how it was permitted. There were roof lines on either side that had been preserved that met the minimum pitch, whereas the rest of the dormer addition did not, and that was administratively allowed. And ultimately, when it comes down to architectural provisions like this one, it isn't so cut and dry. It's not like applying setbacks or maximum building height or lot coverage. There's more subjectivity to it, which when you're trying to apply standards in an objective fashion where they're not construed as guidelines and there's not a separate sort of architectural design review process that is paired with the guidelines, you're kind of forced to make judgment calls as a zoning official at times. And sometimes the code is silent about particular architectural features like dormers. There's other provisions of our code that allow for the zoning official, if there's not a definition provided in the code, then we can seek other sources to determine, okay, what's the commonly accepted definition of such. The zoning administrator is empowered as the official administering the code to make interpretations of the code. And that's exactly what happened with 101 Ardmore, and that's what's happened here with 315.
However, as you said, I believe, if this had been on the front of the structure, there would have never been an issue in your mind. There wouldn't have been a mixed, if you will, disagreement about what constitutes a dormer.
Well, in my mind, this is not a dormer because it's taking the existing building and it's extruding it completely upward without any offset whatsoever.
So
I
mixed
think that's
is-
the only
mixed
place
is
where
the
we
difference
disagree. I
between
think we
Mr. Webb
agree
and you.
that
Yeah.
this addition, where it's located, it's fine, it's appropriate. It's to the rear of the property. It's not going to create a detriment. It's not going to be, in my mind, it's not substantial. If it were at the front of the structure without any other regard for offsets or, and I'm not an architect, so I can't speak the language as good as Mr. Webb can, but I suppose perhaps it's hard to kind of, excuse me, it's hard for me to perhaps speak to hypotheticals without something to react to that's illustrative. So maybe I've gone a little too far in that,
I mean, I
in
think the
hindsight.
short answer would be to extend that front facade a full 2 stories tall with a flat roof on the front is clearly not going to be in line with the mile square guidelines, let alone our roof pitch discussion and is it a dormer, not a dormer. It's just simply not going to fit the mile square guidelines at that point, which is where I think, having the dormer to the rear is allowed by our mile square guidelines. I would also put forth, when there are ambiguities in the code and, maybe sometimes it could default to the rights of the property owner to their ability to improve their property to the greatest extent available to them. Lastly, on the I don't know if you can put my sketch back up here.
Sure.
But
Looks like it got stuck. Just bear with me. Oh, okay. I'll just scroll. Oh, I guess that was the
just
ending
that one.
slide.
I just want the framing slide.
Okay, no problem. There we go.
So, despite the way the elevation drawing appears here, the reality of construction, as I'm trying to show you down here, is that there will be an offset. It'll be about 3 inches. There's a double rafter on the outside. Our first rafter will be on the inside of that. So it's not literally just a piece of trim breaking the siding. There'll be a tiny bit of offset there just by the realities of the construction. So my question to you is, if a piece of trim is not enough and 12 inches is enough, is 4 inches enough to still consider this a dormer on the rear of the house? But as I said, I believe the mile square guidelines also are in effect here, and I think they also carry some weight. And rather than argue about whether it's a dormer or not a dormer, if it were on the front of the building, it would be 2 stories high with a flat roof effectively. It simply would not meet the mile square design guidelines. I wouldn't bring it here, you wouldn't have to make that decision.
As you show in the drawing there, if you do the compliant roof guideline, it certainly changes the look of the structure of the house. Maybe it's a matter of taste. I think it stands out more, a whole lot more. What would we be getting by doing it compliant as far as with structure, with anything? Because I personally, having a flat roof line like it normally is now makes a lot more sense visually, and for the character of the neighborhood and everything else. What would making it be compliant be adding to anything?
Would you like me to respond, Mr. Chair? So if I could just return to the slide for a second. So I believe it was the word absurd that I used in the staff report to describe the way that this looks.
I would agree, actually. But visually seeing it like that, I would agree. I think it would be absurd to do that. And I think using, strict constructionist ruling for required for things that we take, that as a case-by-case basis is an obtuse way to decide something like this also. But yes, I think that roof line, to make it compliant would be different.
It's not better.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Mr. Webb, can we go back to okay, right there. Now, you're talking on the compliant roof pitch, you've got to add an extra set of support beams to get to the top of the roof pitch, correct? Is that what you're doing?
Up here on this one?
Down there on the compliant roof pitch
Oh,
sketch,
right.
you're adding some additional supports to get to the top of the roof pitch, right?
Yeah, what would actually have to happen here, I mean, we really can't build it like I'm illustrating it here. What really has to happen here is you'd have to strip back all this existing roof. These rafters on this side of the ridge, the front side, would have to go down and sister up. They would have to lap the other ones. We would end up taking that ridge out. We would essentially have to prop the entire roof up, take the ridge down, strip the sheeting off, and then try to sister these things up in order to move our ridge up like that.
So
It's-
it wouldn't be structurally sound if you didn't do that. Would that be a fair
This is
statement?
made of wood. I guarantee you, I'm not gonna let anyone build anything that's not structurally sound. That's really not on the table here. I'm saying it's structurally very complicated to make this happen and very expensive. And to
You
Mr.
get a rough
Wyatt's
idea
point.
on the cost of that.
To Mr. Wyatt's point, to what end? What are we gaining?
Yeah. Do you have a rough idea on the cost of that?
No.
And if it's not going to make it less structurally sound, then what would be the reason? Would be my.
So less aesthetically pleasing and not as structurally sound would be the situation there,
To make it compliant.
to make it compliant, correct?
Finished with mink.
Any other questions for either the applicant or staff?
Could I ask a general question really quickly? And I apologize if this has already been answered. But when the roof, the 612, what was the intent of something like that in the original zoning code or whatever it was? So that rainwater could fall off, or?
Do you recall when that happened?
I don't know off the top of my head when the original adoption date was for the mile square design standard. Scott, do you know?
I don't know what the date was, but we had the mile square design standards and they didn't prescribe a particular roof pitch. And there was a time when some members on planning commission or someone writing the code got very concerned about seeing students out on roofs everywhere. They'd climb out the windows and were hanging on porches and hanging on roofs everywhere. And so rather than just say that, roofs should be steep, they set a minimum pitch with the idea that we could keep them off of there. Now that has morphed over time because, there was not an exception when that first was written. There wasn't an exception for the porch roof. But porch roofs in traditional architecture are required to stay below the windows on the second floor, so we could never get that 612 pitch ever on the front porch. So they decided to relax that particular part of it. But, you know, in general, I mean, our mile square design guidelines talk about contextualism and things like that. Also, what was happening is, you know, the sort of worst of the 70s 412 pitch, two-story vinyl sided house was allowed in the mile square. We didn't have any mile square design guidelines. We had our historic district, but the mile square wasn't in it. So they created the historic district guidelines, the mile square guidelines, to try to prevent the worst kind of, you know, just random suburban house being dropped into the mile square, and then roof pitch and things like that sort of became part of it. So it's evolved over time, and I'm assuming it's going to evolve more with our next writing of the code as well. But you know, like a lot of things, things sort of get passed and then they get changed, and it's sort of morphed a little bit over time. But I think the intention started with, let's keep people off the roofs, and also let's stop, 412 suburban ranches or suburban 2 stories from getting into the mile square.
Okay, there are no more questions. Thank you, Mr. Webb. I think we should move into the adjudication phase.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Was there a gentleman, was he going to testify? I wonder?
I wasn't informed that we had another,
No, we don't have any other, okay.
yeah.
Just curious.
I came in with new agenda to discuss.
And Mr. Chair, I was just going to say, if you do want to ask, I didn't know if he was here to speak to that, but if you want to ask the public, perhaps that answers the question, though.
Well, I think he just did. He
Okay.
said he's had
Understood.
some new agenda to talk about. We'll
Okay.
take that up at public comment, so. Let's have a motion to complete the adjudication and then move to a vote and deliberation.
So moved.
Second? Moved and second, so let's deliberate. Comments, observations, concerns, issues from those participating?
I don't think we have a clear mechanism to deny the variance, given past practices. No, it seems very arbitrary on what we would even be, discussing here. If there's other properties with similar construction that's been administratively approved, or, during the current code, I don't know what our mechanism would be to deny it.
I would agree. It seems also like the 612 rule really to be applied to every case. I think I used the word obtuse. I think I'll stick by that. I think that it's and the proposed design looks a lot better. It makes a lot more common sense than if you use the 612 rule to it. And I don't know what the structure gains from that, if it's not making it more structurally sound. I don't know what it would gain from doing that.
You mean, you're talking about what, the presentation of what would be compliant is.
Right, the compliance,
As
right,
opposed to-
exactly.
As opposed to leaving the reveal of a minimum of 12 inches on either side, which would then move into at least staff's view of a dormer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I've got some concerns about the fact that the code says shall. It shall comply, and the applicant says he didn't know about it. But when the applicant comes in and says they don't know about it, it's certainly public of record to find out what, Zach would meet with them, explain what's going on here. So I just have concerns about that. I think we ought to give that some weight in our consideration. Also, I think some of the questions have indicated maybe that we might disagree with Zach's evaluation, whether this variance is substantial or not. So, I'm looking at all the criteria, I'm saying it's about a 50-50 in my mind. It could go either way.
I similarly find myself in the same position, Steve, that this, at one glance, this looks to be not problematic, but the more we talk about it, the more I hear from applicant and staff, the less I find a compelling argument to grant the variance. Whether it's in the front or the back, seems to, for me, seems less compelling an argument. You know, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. I'm not sure, not saying that that's what you said, but at this point, I'm probably on the other side of the request. So,
Steve, to your point about the code language, the shall and must, the way I view that, and perhaps this is incorrect, but, you know, sort of by definition of this board is to grant a variance or something separate from the code language. So are we, in a sense, doing that in every case, right? I mean, right, I mean, the code language is the code language, but we are reviewing and potentially providing a variance for any case.
well, sure, by definition, we are an appeal.
Right,
We
there
are
you go.
appellate.
Appellate, thank
An
you.
appellate board.
But we take an
But-
oath to
but-
enforce the code,
But
and it says
Sure.
shall.
But Steve is right, shall is unequivocal.
It's strong,
It
yeah.
means you will do it.
Yeah.
It's not, gee whiz, maybe you'll do it, but,
But it's been done administratively in
And
the
it could have been
past.
done here if it.
But it-
Right.
that's right.
It could have been done here. I mean, I
This-
don't know what the cost
This
would
didn't have to
been.
be here in that sense. Again, they're not necessarily going with the compliant version, but with the adjustment on both ends of the roof line.
Well, and what
To
is
make it
that?
like art.
And is that the 12 inches?
Well, I don't know, it was,
Whatever Zach says.
So we would have, so that's where I'm going. I mean, we have no, like, it would be a very arbitrary number if we suddenly said, like, 6, 7, 8, right?
Mr. Chairman, may I make a suggestion that we continue this matter, and based upon our conversations, maybe the applicant might run and revise their plan and see if they could get it compliant with Zach's, and maybe not have to be here again. I'm not saying we shouldn't give this gentleman a chance to make the.
well, that's up to the applicant.
Sure.
Well,
You got a door.
if I'm only competing for 4 votes here, I think I would appreciate the opportunity to come back with 5.
I have no objection.
So you're, at this time, withdrawing the application?
Well, I would ask for it to be tabled to have a full voting body. Since the law director
And-
said Mr. Dashdorj can't.
Can we
vote.
table it?
Should we leave it?
You can do a motion to table it, and then if Mr. Webb and the applicant wants to proceed to the next meeting, you would then consider moving it off the table. And I think that's a valid request if the board is willing to consider it.
There's been a motion to table this application. Is there a second?
Well, I would just say, you know, could we still table after an initial vote to see if we?
I don't think so,
We haven't
no,
voted yet.
no.
We've just been discussing.
We're only deliberating at this
So,
point.
so to come back, I understand what you're doing, and appreciate that, but, I mean, to come back with another structural design, I'm
No, I'd
assuming.
like to come back and have 5 voting members.
Members.
The rules of Board of Zoning Appeals is I need 3 votes no matter how many people are here. If
Right.
only 4 of you are allowed to vote tonight, I might want to take my chance on Mr. Dashdorj here next month.
Yes,
And,
and I'll be on time next time, I promise.
Okay.
I see.
I think
There's still a motion.
And Mr. Chair, I would just.
No, go ahead.
So I think there's 2 options, and I think ultimately I would defer probably to the applicant as to what his preference is. But I think option 1 is we do have Mr. Dashdorj here. He, I believe, missed, I would say, a large portion of staff's presentation, but he did not miss the applicant's presentation. And we can ask Mr. Dashdorj, did you have the opportunity to review the staff report, so you've at least read it? So one option, and I would leave this up to the applicant's election here, is if he wants Mr. Dashdorj to participate tonight, and Mr. Dashdorj feels like he can, we could have all 5 members vote, or option 2 is he could move to table it, and I think that's a valid request so that he could have a full vote by the board. So I would defer to Mr. Webb and with his preference.
can I wait and see how he's going to vote?
No.
Fair question.
Well, I mean,
But there's still a motion on the floor to table. We're waiting for a second.
Well,
I will second it. I will
Well,
step out of
well,
the
aren't we-
chair and second that motion.
Well, aren't we deliberating though? We haven't left the deliberation. Can we even motion while we're just deliberating when we have to go back into regular session?
So the motion is, yeah, so I think I would, at this point, you could do it either way. So I think you could either move to close deliberation and then move to table it, or somebody could second the motion to table and then have a vote on that. So it can be done either way.
I think the motion to table now is appropriate, and then we can resolve out of the deliberation. So I'll second the motion to table until the next meeting, so that we have a clear time when that will happen. So
And then
it's been moved and seconded. Here's the tricky part. Heine, would you take the roll on that motion?
Mr. Smith,
The motion is, just to be clear.
Just a table until,
To table to
the
next
next meeting.
Then yes.
Mr. Chafin?
Yes.
Mr. Wyatt?
Yes.
Mr. Des George?
Am I allowed to vote on this?
I'm not sure
Or
he's
abstain?
voting on that.
I would abstain. I'll abstain for
Okay.
everything, yeah.
And
Abstain.
Mr. Russo?
Yes. Okay, so it's been tabled until the next meeting, anticipating a full board present. And any other negotiations and/or changes in the application that may or may not bring it back to us. Okay. All right, let's have a motion to move out of deliberation
I'm going
anyway.
to move out of
Is
deliberation.
there a second?
Second.
Moved and second. I'll take the roll on that.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Chafin?
Yes.
Mr. Wyatt?
Yes.
Mr. Russo?
Yes?
Mr. Des George?
Abstain.
Okay. All right. We have an opportunity for public comment at this point. So you're not interested in making a public comment?
I think I'll pass.
Thank you. You, sir, wish to make a public comment that is not testimony or evidence concerning this case?
No, it does not apply to this case.
Okay. Please step forward, state your name and your interest.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Jeff Zeski, and I am new to the area. Zach is familiar with me, though. And the issue that brought me here was the bike path, which runs right next to my new house that I built. Census had initially said they were gonna come in and do a final grade on both sides of the bike path. And there's a 2-block stretch that never even got reseeded by, under the definition of them putting down seed and straw. There is a 2-foot area on the house side, the residential side of the path, that never got seeded. And a good portion of the area between the bike path and Oxford Brookville Road. You can't cover it. It's one of these things that you can't actually put your lawnmower with one of the front wheels on the bike path and the other one in your yard that you're just not chopping up mud and dirt. I would, and I've got the addresses and the names of the people that it would affect, but it should be corrected, or census should have never gotten paid. I don't know if Rick had signed off on what they were doing in engineering, but it is not satisfactory to the ability of what they have shown or demonstrated in other areas. Because you go down by the middle school and they graded and seeded that, and that's all lush and full. So I know they have the ability, they just didn't apply it to a 2-block range of Cincinnati, or Oxford Brookville Road. And just because I live next to a highway, I don't necessarily want it to look like I live next door to a highway. These things should have been done correctly in the first place and should be corrected now. Or, as I said, it may be an issue for Rick or Scott from engineering. I just moved in 4 months ago. I spent 2.5 weeks in a hotel because I didn't have finished grade. And I was not allowed to get occupancy, not even a temporary occupancy permit. And if I'm being held to those standards as a new home builder to the community, then the community itself should be held to those same standards that contractors are doing the work on. And I would really, I'm more so trying to get it on record that I don't know if engineering has signed off on that portion and allowed payment to them. But one of the two, it's, if they don't do the repair, I've got a 100-foot stretch, 2 foot wide, that is gonna need to be tilled, new topsoil mixed in, and seeded and strawed. And that's not counting the area between the bike path and the highway. And it is that is an expensive cost. I spent $14,000 in sod, and for them to come through, they said they only needed a foot wide area to lay the path correctly. And I believe the setback was correct on that. I know me and Zach had looked up, also planting trees along there. So I talked to Zach last week, but for them to come through and not meet the setback that I had to and provide a correct grade to the property, it shouldn't have been proved, or shouldn't have been approved if it was. If not, engineering needs to recontact them and have them come out and repair these 9 houses to what they said they were gonna do in their contract.
Mr. Zeski, welcome to Oxford. I'm
Thank you.
sorry that as a new resident, you're having a less than positive experience, particularly with our bike path and.
No, the
and
bike
your-
path.
And your property. And believe me, sir, if I could solve your problem, I would. However, this board really doesn't have any jurisdiction whatsoever over the issue.
Now,
The issue that-
isn't, Zach, weren't you in charge of the setback for the path onto the residential properties?
No. I was not
Okay.
in charge of the bike path project.
Okay.
So,
'Cause-
well, be known that your comments certainly now are on the record, so you've accomplished that, and that might get some interest among those who watch these proceedings. I would direct you to the city manager's office.
Okay.
If you've talked to him, and I'm sure he will be more than willing to respond to your concerns.
Okay. I greatly appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have a good evening.
Okay, if there are any other business before the board, hearing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Chafin?
Yes.
Mr. Wyatt?
Yes.
Mr. Russo?
Yes.
Mr. Des George?
Abstain.
Just so you know.
The rare abstaining
Yeah.
from adjourning.
I
Continues forever.
I have some experience